1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2.
1, 2, 3, 4.
This is Sergeant Major Ford of 35. What's the name of the street?
Avenue.
Collard Avenue, Newcastle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right, don't worry about this microphone. It's I'll just put it down and we'll leave it. Let's turn it down a bit. 2, 3, 4. Sorry, you were a regular soldier.
No, I was a TA. I was
Ah.
always TA. You see, having had an accident in my hand, wouldn't accept me in the regular army. So I joined the TA, but I'd already was in the TA before I had the accident. So they allowed me to stay on. And I was in the Royal Garrison Artillery at the time. We were 6-inch guns. We had 6-inch howitzers. And we nationally mobilised, and we concentrated at Stone in the Lotus Sports Pavilion. From there we moved to Bradford-on-Avon. We were there for a short time, did a few manoeuvres, and then we moved off from there on Winter's Day to France. We arrived in France at Cherbourg and boarded the train there, and eventually arrived at a little village called Vevoin. We did a few weeks there, and then we started to move all around France. We did about 4,000 miles all told in France, and I think that we must have passed through every First World War town of importance in northern France. That includes Ypres, Albert, Bapaume, you name it, we were through it. Anyway, we eventually arrived down at Alsace-Lorraine. There we were we were in a little village called Mametz, and from there we learned that we'd been granted the honour of going into the Maginot Line and taking our guns with us. Well, we eventually went into the Maginot Line. The gun pits, however, had to be altered to suit our guns, because our guns had a larger or a wider wheelbase than the French guns. So we had quite a busy job altering the gun pits. Some, of course, we had to make new ones for. It was quite a novel experience. We were in a little wood, and we never saw any action, of course, and we never were right in the front of the Maginot Line. However, one day we got the order to move, to get ready to move, and they said we were going back to refit. Our guns being rather ancient, World War I guns actually they were. And we thought this was quite true, but however, the story's quite old now. We weren't going, we were actually retreating out of France. Well, of course, we made our way back, and we made our way to a place called Londiniers, and there, just before that, we had fought a rearguard action, as it were, but we eventually got bypassed Caen and arrived at Le Havre, where we spent 3 nights in a wood, continually bombed by the Stukas. And at last, however, we got word that the Lady of Man had come in, and we boarded the Lady of Man and made our way across the sea, of course, and landed in Southampton. Southampton.
This would be before Dunkirk, would it? Or
After Dunkirk, 3 weeks after Dunkirk. We came out with the Ireland Division. Well, we from Southampton we went to Aldershot. From Aldershot we eventually arrived in Rill. There we spent, I think it was 3 weeks. From Rill, we boarded the train and went to Liverpool. From Liverpool to the Isle of Man. There we did 8 weeks in the Isle of Man, just vedettes and odd jobs, you know. But mostly guarding civil internees, that is Italians and some Germans. The women, I understand, were at Port Erin, I think it was, while the men were in Douglas itself. They commanded the whole of the big villas up towards Marina Drive and all there. And as a matter of fact, I was the sergeant in charge of police there at that time. Well, we spent, as I say, 8 weeks there, and then we handed over to an infantry regiment, and we came back to Liverpool. From Liverpool, part of the batteries, part of the regiment rather, went to Workington, and part to Fleetwood. I was one of the part that went to Fleetwood. Well, I stayed there for about 6 weeks or so, and then, incidentally, during the action in France, several of us had been recommended for promotion and medals, of course. Well, I happened to have the good fortune to bring a Scamell out and do odd jobs, and they recommended me. I had to recommend, like. However, while in the Isle of Man, the recommends were asked for, as they generally are by the War Office, and our colonel, who didn't agree with recommends or anything like that, refused to send them up. So we didn't get anything. But however, while we were in Fleetwood, I and 8 other personnel, among them our PSI, who was Permanent Staff Instructor, were to go to another regiment, the Royal Horse Artillery, which was a TA regiment, formed about 12 to 18 months before the war, I think. And they were stationed at Malvern Link. And we would go then on promotion, each one. Well, we eventually arrived at Malvern Link. When we got there, their major at that time naturally interviewed us and called us a very scruffy lot, which of course we were. We came out of France. I came out in a pair of gum boots, just battle dress trousers, a shirt and a tin hat. That's all I had. However, I did scrounge a battle dress, but with no lanyard and with no numerals on the tunics or anything. Of course, that didn't suit the major. His regiment was like up to scratch, you know, real pucker. However, he said we were to go back to our own regiment. He didn't want us, which we really wanted, you know. We didn't want to join this regiment. We wanted to stay with our own chaps. Well, we went back. I lasted there about 3 days when the War Office, of course, demanded that we should go and rejoin this regiment. The idea was a kind of a stiffening nucleus in the regiment. You see, we were considered veterans at that time, having been through the fiasco in France. Well, we had to go back. In due course, incidentally, this regiment was armed with French 45s. 45s, you know, the 75s, sorry.
No.
75s. And my battery that I was attached to got a quote of these little guns. And I was more or less floating around spare, as it were. So, however, they were going to make a 6-gun battery of it, you see, a 6-gun battery, so that there would come a vacancy for a sergeant major and other ranks. In time, there did come to, I'm overrunning my tale actually. We moved from Malvern Link to Stourbridge. And at Stourbridge, after a few weeks, they arrived for us the new 25-pounder, which we picked up at the station. Therefore, we became, instead of having 4 detachments, there were actually 6, so that I took charge of one squad, you see. I became Sergeant Major.
What was your rank before?
Troop Sergeant. I held the rank of TSM at one time, but that rank was abolished. Perhaps you wouldn't remember it, but it was abolished. I'd been down to the School of Artillery and passed out, and I was a Troop Sergeant Major, and then of course when the rank abolished I had to drop that rank and revert to Troop Sergeant. Well, I made Sergeant Major, of course, at Stourbridge, took control of Charlie Troop, and from then on we had a false move to Avonmouth, ostensibly to go to the Middle East, where we weren't supposed to know, but we all knew in our own minds it was Egypt. Anyway, we had to come back due to some technical itch in the ship. But a couple of days later we moved again, and we did eventually board the ship, the Reina del Pacifico. Well, coming out of the harbour at Avonmouth, she hit a sunken wreck or a log of some sort. She did something anyway that damaged the propeller and slightly damaged the rudder. Well, we got up as far as Glasgow, and then we had to put back into Liverpool. We had to put back for repairs to the propeller and rudder. There we did 3 weeks fire watching in the big warehouses around Bootle area, which wasn't too good. However, it passed off. We were all right. However, when the ship was ready, we went on board, and due to the fact that the enemy was so busy at that time sinking our shipping, we had to take the voyage via America, Newfoundland, and that way, you know, the long way round. We couldn't go through the Med at all. And we were on the boat, on the Reina del Pacifico, 10 weeks. And we eventually landed in Durban. I landed on my birthday eve, actually, the 27th of May. And from Durban, the boat docked in Durban, and we were taken to about 5 miles outside of Durban. I forgot the name of the flipping place. Is it in there, love? It's a race. There's a race course there. Now, what the devil was the name of that place? I just can't think of it.
Well, never mind. It was just outside Durban, then.
Yes, it was 5 miles by rail outside of Durban, and we stayed there 3 weeks. Then, of course, we got the orders to come to Durban and board the ship, and there was 3 ships to take the whole of the convoy that came from England. There was the Ile-de-France, the New Mauritania, and the New Amsterdam. Now, we went on board the New Amsterdam, and of course, as again, due to the action of the German Navy, we had to take the long way round and go through the Red Sea and that way, and so it took us 2 weeks to get to Port Tewfik. Well, just before we landed in Port Tewfik, I was taken ill with heat stroke and bronchitis, so that I left the boat as she docked. I left the boat before the troops disembarked, and I went into the 13th Field General Hospital at just outside Port Tewfik, and I was in there for 2 weeks. Then I came back. And I should have reported to Almarza, which was our transit camp. But my regiment was at Mina, and I didn't intend to lose my regiment if I could help it, so I proceeded to go to Mina. Well, by that time, you perhaps will recall that Crete had happened, Greece and Crete.
Mm.
Well, we had to evacuate Crete, as perhaps you know from history, and we were absorbing some of the people who had come from Crete, and they had absorbed, during that time that I was in hospital, another sergeant major, so that I was due to go to the transit camp, and I landed up in, along with several others, including a couple of officers, I landed up in Heliopolis.
Where's that?
Heliopolis is just outside Cairo.
Uh-huh. Mm.
It's like on the suburbs of Cairo.
This would be around about 1941 now,
Yes,
would it?
it's
Yeah.
all in 1941. Well, I was there about, not more than 10 days. Really, I was convalescing, I should have been. But when they called for volunteers for a regiment that was up in the desert, 30 miles beyond Barani, and it was the 31st Field Regiment. Well, I, along with a Sergeant Powell from Stoke, and several other chaps, volunteered to go up. What really happened was that if I'd have remained in Heliopolis, I should have lost my rank, you see, because a war substantive rank had to come down if you went ill or anything like that for a certain time. So I volunteered to go up, and I went up as their Sergeant Major. I joined the 31st Field Regiment, and from then on took command of the battery, and under Captain Morgan. We moved to
Did you see much action with the battery? Did you? What sort
not
of?
a lot up to the time we were captured.
No.
We did a few sniping guns.
Mm.
You know, a gun would go out, a couple of Kazee guns would go out at night. And incidentally, this regiment pinched our 25-pounders that belonged actually to the Royal Artillery Regiment that I was with. Because they were so short of arms in the Middle East that our arms had gone on before us and arrived before us, and they were granted to the 31st Field, more or less, you see, and they had our guns. So I was more or less going to a gun that I knew and I was familiar with, which was all to the good, really. This regiment that I went to had seen quite a lot of action. They'd been all through Eritrea and right down into Abyssinia to Addis Ababa. And they'd come back again, of course, and immediately they were pushed right up the desert. Well, they had a very rough time, and they were granted little or no leave, so there was one or two dissenters.
This was before you joined them?
Before I joined them, just prior to me joining them. And there was one or two in the pen, and one or two had gone on the loose, I can tell you. That's beside the point, more or less. But however, in November, I think it was November the 17th, we got orders that we were now known as the first army. And our officers are quite enthusiastic about it, because they reckoned that now, before we were just regiment, now we were an army, and we were more or less strong. So we said we were going to move, and the move consisted of two columns, one going up the coast in loops, and the other one going straight driving up the desert. You understand?
Yes.
Straight up the desert,
Yes.
one in loops.
Yeah.
That was to cut out any bottlenecks of enemy or do anything like that. But if you recall, or perhaps you'll have read about, there was a place called Al Fire. Actually, the name is Al Faya, but we call it Al Fire Pass, and Saloom. Well, talking about have we seen any action? We did have a tank battle in the Oasis. Oh dear, see my memory from the
alright.
English is going again. I remember it just now. The
Was it against the Italians or the Germans? This would be
the Germans,
the Germans
tanks.
now.
You see,
yes.
the Germans have brought all the tanks. They had a mass attack on these Oases.
This would be Rommel.
City Omars.
Oh.
The Omars.
Hmm.
It was City Omars. Well, they got anti-aircraft guns. We got the 6-inch hours. We got 25-pounders. And also every kind of gun we could get. And we gave them a real duffing up there.
What was it? What were the conditions like? I mean, I
Oh, they were terrible.
yeah.
The conditions, you mean, that we lived under?
And yes.
Yes, they were terrible. They were, you got the sand for start, which was a beastly thing. It got in everything, you know. It got in all your food. It got in all your bedding. It got, no matter how you sealed an article up, it got in somewhere. Then there was the terrible flies. When one had any food, he'd continually got to keep brushing his hand over his mess tin or whatever he was having his food in to keep the flies away. Telephonists were plagued with them. Well, you see, they got a headset clamped on and they got an handpiece in their hand, and the flies are continually settling on the corners of the mouth and on the eyes and in the nostrils, because they were used to it from the Egyptians, who, as you know, suffer greatly from the flies, that eye disease that they have. Anyway, the conditions were very bad, and conditions for map reading were absolutely terrible. To us especially, who hadn't had a lot of experience in desert work. There was absolutely no landmarks. Landmarks were just non-existent, because what happened to be a landmark 1 hour could disappear in the next. For instance, a big vehicle, say a 3 to 6 tonner, or even a tank, at less than a mile became a shivering matchstick in the heat haze, you know. And it was just nothing romantic about the desert. I reckon there's nothing at all romantic about the desert, just a dry, desolate place filled with what we call beetles and flies and horrible little crawling things. Anyway,
And sorry, what was it like? It must have been very difficult to fight in the desert. I mean,
it was difficult because, you see, the difficulty was in recognizing your own troops. For instance, an incident arose where we had, in a 1 square mile, we had moved to 4 separate positions when Jerry was trying to advance onto us. Now, in these 4 separate positions, we had to keep shelling him, you see. He was advancing with infantry and motorised columns, whereas we'd only got artillery. We'd no infantry at all. It was just our regiment. We were saved, actually, by a squadron of I think they were, what's that plane now? No, they weren't Spitfires. Spitfires couldn't operate at that time. There. What was the next one?
Hurricanes?
Hurricanes. Squadron of Hurricanes came out, and I think there's about 6 of them. And they kept repeatedly coming out and firing on the Jerrys, and of course driving them back, which saved us more or less. Now, as we were coming back over the desert again, back from the forward position, we encountered a column, and the leading column it turned out to be 2 or 3 Allied vehicles, but there were several German vehicles mingled amongst them, captured. And the first thing we did, of course, was to get the guns in position to open fire. Well, we opened fire on them, and I believe we inflicted some casualties. and they opened fire on us. And in the process, my driver was killed. A shell entered the back of his towing vehicle and went right through him. And he was the only casualty in ours, my driver. But it turned out to be a New Zealand column that had encountered a German column, beat them up and captured some vehicles, you see. Well, it was so hard to distinguish between one column and another that those conditions arose. Another time, 3 tanks attacked us, and they put a shell in between my driver and myself. One landed by the side of the outside the truck, by the side of the driver, down on the sand, and another one hit his tool chest. And for weeks we carried a broken spanner. There was a moving spanner, and it had just sheared the head right off, and he carried that about with him as a souvenir for weeks. So that it was very difficult to tell friend from enemy in the desert because of the heat haze, you know. You had to be very close to each other to be able to tell. It made for very bad conditions.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Before I interrupted you, you were saying that you were advancing, I think.
Yes, we were advancing. We had gone round. We'd gone round Saloom, and we'd gone down to another pass. Instead of attacking Saloom and El Faya, which was heavily defended, we had gone down the escarpment and gone round another pass, and that's how they had captured it, you see. Part of the column come back and captured Saloom. Well, we continued on, and our object, incidentally, the 2 columns are called Big Brother and Little Brother. That was the code name. Our object was to get to Tamimi Aerodrome, and we were making for Gazala. In fact, we were almost in Gazala itself when the German attacked with a full division to cut the columns right through. And at that time, my column consisted of 1 regiment of artillery, which was mine, 1 full company of buffs, 1 battalion of buffs, and 2 companies of Indians, the Rajputana Rifles and the Marathas, and that was the full column. Well, of course, as you probably have read, a Jerry column consisted of tanks, guns and infantrymen, plus aircraft. I sent his Stukas over, of course.
This would be the Africa Corps, would it?
Yes,
yeah.
This was the Africa Corps. This was, of course, before they advanced as far as they did, you know. This was the second push-up we were on.
Yes, this would be Rommel. You'd push them back as far as...
Well, until this column came, we were well on our way to
Gazala.
No, we were on our way to Gazala, but we eventually finished up at not Maloney, the other one. Oh, good God!
All right. Sidi Barani.
Yes. Now, what was the one further on? Benghazi.
Benghazi. Oh, yeah.
Well, this German column, as I say, attacked us. Now, we were ordered to hold them, while our other columns fell back and regrouped. Well, we held them for 3 days, or rather 2 days and a half. At 11 o'clock on the 3rd morning, the gap had closed and we could no longer retreat if we wanted to. But we did hold him for that length of time, but he attacked in force and, of course, overran us. We had 2 casualties there. My captain, my commanding officer, Captain Morgan, received wounds that proved fatal. He had both hands shattered, the right foot blown off, and the left foot shattered so badly that it was hanging off, more or less. And he was on #1 gun. Now, in a tank shoot, a sergeant major takes up the position of an officer. and he actually ordered me to go and look for ammunition. Now, and my job as sergeant is I'd got to know all about ammunition, rations, etc., etc. And I told him there was no ammunition. We got it all at the guns. But he, in a bit of a temper, and he ordered me go and have a look, find some. And of course, I had to do that. And he took my position as the gun controlling officer on number 1 gun, and that's where he got his. So my fate out one day that I should escape and he should get it. He actually died in my arms, practically, you know. Well, the Jerry, as I say, overran us. I dropped in a slit trench, a signal slit trench, because I knew it was useless going any further, and the bullets were humming all around us like busy bees, you know, and shells and all that. So I dropped in the slit trench, and of course the old Jerry tank came up, and rouse, out we come, at the surrender, of course. Well, strangely enough, it wasn't like I thought it'd be. I hadn't got a German sticking the bayonet at me and all that. They're just walking around and saying, like, make your way higher up there to where the rest of the gang is, kind of thing, you know. So I was making my way up, and I passed my commanding officer lying on the ground. And I went to him and asked him how it was. But of course, by that he was incoherent. He didn't know me, and he couldn't tell who I was, and nothing about it. I couldn't get any reply from him. But I gave him a cigarette, pushed a cigarette in his mouth, which he couldn't smoke, of course. Covered him up with what I could like, you know, that was lying around. And just then the German doctor come up, and I said, is there any hope of getting him on an ambulance? He said, no, I'm sorry, there isn't. He said, I'll do what I can for him, he said, but I'm afraid it's hopeless. And he proceeded, of course, to do what he could, but as he said, it was hopeless. He couldn't do much. He'd only got a few things by him. Anyway, he said, well, I shall have to take his book. I said, oh, you mustn't take that. He said, I shall have to do, he said, because of letting his people, or letting the British authorities know. Well, he took the book, of course. I couldn't do much about it if I'd have wanted to. But I had to leave him, and I asked him if it was possible at all, would he send some conveyance to take him to hospital. But by that time, I finished talking, the German doctor told me he'd have to go because he was with his troops and he had to follow them up because that was his job. So he'd have to leave him, and he said he couldn't promise anything, but if there was any trucks lying about, he would do it. But by that time, one could see that my captain was nearly finished. You know, he was dead almost. He was unconscious in any case. He was that far gone. Now the other casualty was Lieutenant Ablett, Ronnie Ablett, quite a nice chap. He got a piece of shrapnel in the privates, and he sat on the bank side, just doubled up on the bank side, and I asked him how he was. He said, not too bad, but you could see he was in pain, of course. And by that time I had to move on and join the column. What happened to him, I don't know. I still don't know. Well, after we got the column assembled, the Jerry mounted a machine gun on trucks, and various guards took the positions, and all the captured people started to move off along the desert. Well, we moved all that afternoon, and throughout most of the night. No food, of course, no rations of any sort. And one or two chaps did. We went down a rocky defile, and one or two chaps, I believe, did hide themselves and probably managed to get away. The fate I don't know, of course. Just imagine they were on the desert. They had no compass, which was really necessary on a desert. You couldn't read a map on a desert. You had to have the compass to guide you in any case. And so one or two did manage to get away, I believe. Anyway, we carried on until we eventually reached an Italian outpost, you know, where they got the old netting strung up, and we went into the cage for a brief halt. We were there an hour or two, and then we resumed our march again.
What was the cage? Was it just...
Well, barbed wire, you know, strung out, and some kind of wire netting. But it was more or less a rough kind of a square, you know, strung out with barbed wire and stuff. We spent an hour or two there. Still no food. We resumed our march, and we marched on then to this, as I say, proper camp. Or rather, it wasn't a proper camp, it was an hastily constructed one, but it was a better one than we had spent this hour or two in, you see. And there we were given a biscuit each, a square biscuit, roughly about 6 inches square perhaps, and about 3/4 of an inch thick and very hard. And that was the rations. And the next day, late on in the morning, there came some trucks up, they put us on board, and we proceeded on to go to Benghazi then.
This was the Italians that were taking you
Yes,
now, was it?
the Jerry handed us over to the Italians with apologies. As I said before, he apologised for handing us over, but he got to carry on continuing the war kind of thing, while the Italian did their guarding.
Was there a great deal of difference between the Germans and the Italians, do you think?
Yes, really a great deal of difference. We, as British soldiers, held the Italians in contempt. I think you'll find that attitude prevailed throughout the British Army. They were a contemptible lot, more or less, to us. All they thought about was swigging wine and all sorts of dirty habits. Anyway, less said about them, the better. Anyhow, the German didn't also held them in contempt, as far as I could see anyway, and I think you'll find that a lot of the war soldiers agree with me.
Yeah.
We, as I say, we loaded into the trucks and we went on to Benghazi. Benghazi, we remained there in transit, as it were. Then we went to, and we were ordered to pack up what bit of stuff we'd got, as we were going to another camp. We went to the railway station, marched to the railway station. There we boarded trucks, open trucks, en route for the Garian Mountains. We got in the trucks, as I said. The train somehow broke down halfway and left us, took off the train, proceeded on its way and left us for 36 hours standing there in the trucks. It came back next day, picked us up, took us onto the foot of the mountains, and there we walked, as I told you before, 7 miles up the mountains, and landed in this old cavalry barracks. We stayed there. There was no comforts at all, no beds, no blankets, nothing issued. The barest food, and we landed there about 2 days before Christmas. On Christmas Day they said they'd give us an extra ration of food, which of course they did. They gave us extra ration of beans and extra ration of meat, but the beans were weevily, and we'd no proper firewood to cook the meat or the beans either, so we had it half cooked, what there was of it. Well, after Boxing Day, we said...
This would be Christmas 41, would it?
Yes,
yes.
Christmas still 41, and we spent the Boxing Day there, I remember. Then we got to go down. They said we were going to move us to Tripoli. Well, we got halfway down the mountain on the second day after Christmas, when we had orders to proceed back again because the British Navy was stopping the Jerry from taking us across. So we marched back again. As I say, we spent a miserable night in the barracks. No blankets again, no food, nothing. And the next morning They said it was all clear now, we could start off for Tripoli. We marched down the mountain again. We boarded the old train again. This time we did have some cattle coaches. Well, we moved into Tripoli, and we marched straight down to the mole where we boarded a German vessel called the SS Ankara. There we were put down in the Ols, and we remained there for the next 3 days and 3 nights. We weren't allowed up only for a drop of water. And we were queuing, there was a queue all day for water. One took his turn, you know, and then he did perhaps 2 hours in the queue, and then was relieved by his mate, who took 2 hours, and then relieved again by another mate. You see, and that's how we had to get a drop of water. Well, we eventually arrived at Naples on the fourth morning. We got taken off the ship, formed up again in the column. We were marched along the quayside, and all the quayside was lined with Germans and some Italians who jeered at us, of course, and took photographs. And we eventually arrived at the dockside station, where we boarded the train and were taken to Capua, which was a proper camp, but only a transit camp. We spent, I think it was about 20 odd days there, of which 18, very few of us had the trousers off. We did have tents there, we were all in tents there, and there was 18 to a tent, and 18 tents to a line. I took charge of a line. By that I mean I had to superintend the issue of all foods that came up, and anything that was going, I had to superintend the issue of it, you see. Well, I had quite a number of New Zealanders in with me, quite a number in my tents, and they were all right, the chaps were all right, but like everyone else, they were only after all the food they could get, or anything else they could scrounge. While we were there, we received some British parcels, and I think it ran 1 between 3. Well, the thing was to divide it up. Who was to have what? Now, by this time, we'd more or less formed a mate, you know, we'd got a mate each. Well, I'd dropped in with a chap named Pompey Ireland, who was a company sergeant major, and we were kind of chums together, you see. So we had to get another one to share our parcel. Well, it was a considerable joke sharing so much sugar for one and so much tea for another, etc. Will you have this in place of that, you know? Will you have this tin of meat while we have this half pound of butter, or something like that, or actually margarine? And there were tins of bacon, which of course had to be shared up. Well, of course, naturally everybody wanted to share of the good things, such as any meats that were going. Of course, we all wanted a bit of it each. And it was a very difficult job sharing the third of a parcel, I can tell you. But that happened about 3 times, actually, while I was a prisoner. It happened when we eventually arrived in 59 at one time. Well, we stayed at Capua, as I say, some 20 odd days. And there it was really pitiful. It rained every day for 18 days out of the time we spent there. And quite a lot of our chaps contracted dysentery. Well, the pitiful sight was to see some poor chap rise out of his bed because he couldn't do much. You couldn't walk about, in that it was just a quagmire, the camp was. And of course the latrines were just a trench dug out in the ground. And so many had used them so many times that the bank had kind of rounded itself off, you know. And you had to keep coming farther back for fear you slipped in. So you can imagine the mess that was on top of the bank. Well, some of these poor chaps, you know, they could hardly walk. They'd get off the bed and just get outside the tent, and too late. It was a terrible thing. There was no doctor, with no medical supplies of any kind. And the only thing that the Italian issued was a bit of grub, you know, and that consisted sometimes of rice, boiled rice as it were, and sometimes it was you got macaroni, which consisted of a mess of water and a few grey pieces of macaroni floating in it. Now and again you had an issue of an onion or a lemon. The onions are sweet, by the way, and they could be eaten raw. They weren't too bad at all. But that was all we had issued, and this third of a parcel, as I said. Eventually, however, the transition period being over, we boarded the train and were taken to Civigliano, which was Campo 59. From there, of course, we got established. Parcels came fairly regularly, and with a parcel, of course, you got 50 cigarettes or 2 ounces of tobacco, whichever you preferred, a week, while parcels were available.
What did PG 59 look like? I mean, you drove up
Well,
to
that actually again was a camp. By that I mean a barracks, and it was walled all round. It was well, it was an oblong. What would it be? It would be quite a big oblong, and there was I think it's about 16 big army huts on it. The sergeants occupied one army hut on their own. Only sergeants and sergeant majors allowed in that hut. Well, each one of us had a hut, or not each one of us, but though, as far as the huts went, there was a sergeant major in charge. Now my hut was number 15. Now I was responsible for disciplining the hut. For any notices that went out, I had to give them out. I also had an hut orderly, as it were. And several amusing incidents occurred in 59. By the way, we used to get concerts up. We had a band there. This Pompey, my friend, was a bandmaster, among his other things, and he was a trumpeter. He organised a band. We had people writing music, and we got a concert up. I used to do a turn as Mother Bloggins. My wife's got a card somewhere. Yeah, over the garden wall stuff, you know, telling jokes and rather played. Anyway.